In this video, we're breaking down the most influential people in the world of darts. Phil Taylor, Michael van Gerwen, Eric Bristow, and Raymond van Barneveld, four legends who dominated their eras and changed the game forever. But what made them so unstoppable, and what were their biggest weaknesses? From Taylor's ruthless dominance to Bristow's unmatched swagger, van Gerwen's explosive power to van Barneveld's unshakable resilience, this is the ultimate marathon breaking down the peaks and pitfalls of darts' most influential icons. Did you catch what Phil Taylor said? He actually claimed that Luke Littler could eclipse his record of 16 world titles, pointing out that Littler has a full 12-year head start compared to when Taylor won his first. Pretty bold, right? That got everyone talking, and believe it or not, there are folks who agree with Taylor's claim. But then there are those who remember exactly what prime Phil Taylor was like.
But they all count in that outer ring 7-7.
For 3.5 decades, Taylor wasn't just the best, he was the benchmark. He dismantled his opponents. From relentless scoring power to a mental game that broke legends before they even stepped on stage, Taylor set records that still stand untouched. So today, we're taking a deep dive back into the golden years to truly appreciate just how good prime Phil Taylor really was. Ready to take this walk down memory lane? Let's get into it. Phil Taylor wasn't just dominant, he was inevitable. If you played professional darts between the early 90s and the late 2000s and 10s, your fate was sealed before you even stepped on stage. You weren't facing a man, you were facing a machine, programmed to humiliate you leg after leg until you either walked off in stunned silence or clapped politely, pretending this was just another day at the office. It rarely was. Before Taylor, darts was a sport of streaky form and inconsistent champions. After Taylor, it was an execution ground. Some players had great years. Taylor had great decades. 16 world titles, 14 in the PDC, over 200 professional tournament wins. At his best, he made even world-class opponents look like pub players who'd stumbled into a nightmare. And the worst part? They knew it was coming. There was no mystery to Taylor's brilliance. His strategy was terrifyingly simple. Hit a treble 20, then another, then another. Leave yourself on a finish, take it out with mechanical precision, rinse and repeat. His ability to maintain that cycle for years on end is what broke his rivals, because it wasn't just about throwing good darts. It was about knowing deep down that the man across from you didn't miss, that even if you played the best darts of your life, it still might not be enough. Ask anyone who played him in his prime, and they'll tell you the same thing. He had an aura, that invisible force field champions carry where, even before a dart is thrown, the opponent already feels like they're behind. You could see it in the body language, the hesitation before a throw, the quick shake of the head after Taylor opened with 180, the slow dawning realization that this wasn't going to end well. Taylor didn't just set records, he treated them like playthings. Take his performance at the 2010 World Match Play. He averaged 106.31 over an entire match. That number shouldn't even be possible. To put that in perspective, most pros dream of averaging 100. Anything above 105 is world class. Taylor walked in, obliterated Raymond van Barneveld, who averaged 100.11 with one of the most clinical displays of finishing ever seen, and walked out with another trophy for the shelf.
Authority, 64 for Phil Taylor for an 11th World Match Play title at the Seaside. Sid!
Fat 16. Double thereof. Green bit!
Green bit it is! Phil Taylor in a magnificent final!
Take the 2001 World Championship final against John Park. The Canadian played out of his skin, hitting huge scores, taking out massive finishes, and Taylor, he dismantled him 7-0 in the World Final. And then there was the 2013 World Championship Final against Michael van Gerwen, the rising superstar of darts. Van Gerwen had just thrown a near-perfect game earlier in the tournament, hitting 17 perfect darts in a row, and was being hyped as the future of the sport. This was supposed to be his moment. Taylor had other plans. He took van Gerwen apart 7-4, reminding everyone that future great meant nothing when present great was still around.
Double 16 for the match, and it is world title number 16 for Phil Taylor, and it may well be the sweetest of the lot. He has seen off the next great darting superstar, twice coming from 2 sets behind to win and claim the crown for the first time since 2010.
When you talk about Phil Taylor, you're not just talking about a great darts player, you're talking about the darts player, the standard, the reason why every professional today had to raise their game. The man who took darts from smoky pub rooms to packed arenas and £1,000,000 prize pools. And sure, Taylor says Littler might break his record, but some records don't fall easily. Some standards are set so high that even the greatest talents struggle to reach them. Phil Taylor's journey to darts immortality didn't begin in a glamorous arena with roaring crowds and £1,000,000 prize pools. It began in a smoky Stoke-on-Trent pub, with a pint in one hand and a set of battered darts in the other. This wasn't the story of a natural-born prodigy, some wunderkind destined for greatness from childhood. Taylor was a working-class guy, holding down jobs in a ceramics factory, throwing darts for fun. If you told him then that he'd become the most dominant player in the history of the sport, he'd probably have laughed and asked if you were buying the next round. But then came Eric Bristow. A 5-time world champion and one of the sport's biggest personalities, Bristow wasn't just a legend, he was a kingmaker. He could spot talent, and when he saw Taylor, he saw potential. Not a fully formed champion, but someone who could be molded into one. Bristow didn't just mentor him, he funded him, giving him £10,000 to kickstart his career. In return, Taylor promised to pay it back once he started winning, a simple deal. Except Bristow underestimated just how quickly that investment would pay off.
We'll see how much I'm wasting my money in the end, and he played well in the end, and well, the rest of it is history, isn't it?
Is he the best player you've ever seen?
Consistent-wise, you can't argue with him. No. I mean, I always say, if you're looking at people, you've got to look, you know, what I always say, what have they won? You know, you look at Phil's resume, I mean, it's ridiculous. 13 times world champion, all these other tournaments, 5, 8 times.
It's incredible.
Brilliant averages, so many 9-dart 501s on TV. I mean, the man speaks for himself. Yeah. You know?
Taylor didn't just improve under Bristow's guidance, he became terrifyingly efficient. The raw skill was refined into something lethal, and in 1990, the pupil destroyed the master. The BDO World Championship final saw Taylor step up against Bristow himself, the man who made him, the man who believed in him, and Taylor showed his gratitude by wiping the floor with him 6-1. It wasn't even close. The darts world had been put on notice. That win was the start of something bigger. Because Taylor wasn't content with winning once, he wanted to dominate, and he wouldn't just change his own legacy, he would change the sport itself. Just 2 years after his first world title, darts split in half. The top players, frustrated with how the BDO was running things, broke away to form the PDC. This wasn't just a business move, it was a revolution. Taylor, along with 15 other players, took a risk, betting that this new organization would be the future of the sport. At the time, it was a gamble. In hindsight, it was the moment that secured Taylor's place as the undisputed king of darts. The PDC became Taylor's playground. As the organization grew, so did his legend. The wins started piling up, the records began falling. Opponents weren't just losing to Taylor, they were being destroyed. And while other players had great seasons, great runs, great moments, Taylor was building an empire. By the mid-90s, it wasn't a question of whether he would win, it was a question of how badly he'd beat you. And soon, that empire would turn into an unstoppable dynasty. Phil erased the concept of competition. He wasn't part of an era, he was the era. It wasn't just that Taylor won, it was how he won. Most players would have been satisfied with a tight victory, a dramatic last leg decider, maybe even a scrappy comeback. Not Taylor. He preferred ritual sacrifices. That was the Taylor effect. He forced players into desperation mode before they even realized it. You'd see it happen in real time. The quick glance at the scoreboard confirming what they already knew. Taylor was ahead and he wasn't slowing down. Take the 2002 World Championship final against Peter Manley. Manley was a great player, confident, brash, never one to back down. But against Taylor, he became a spectator in his own final. Taylor managed another world final whitewash, 7-0. A match that should have been the biggest test of his career. Instead, it was a televised execution. By the end, Manley wasn't even mad, he just looked relieved it was over. Other legends had rivalries. Taylor had victims, John Part, Dennis Priestley, Peter Manley, Raymond van Barneveld, all great players in their own right, all left in Taylor's wake. And when a new wave of talent emerged, led by the likes of Adrian Lewis, Gary Anderson, and Michael van Gerwen, Taylor didn't fade. He adapted, reinvented himself, kept winning. Even as younger, faster, more explosive players arrived, Taylor remained a constant. He was the final boss, the immovable object, the last man standing when the dust settled. His presence on the oche was so intimidating that players would celebrate just getting close to beating him. That was the level of dominance we're talking about. But of course, no reign lasts forever. And while Taylor was still racking up wins, something was beginning to shift. The new generation wasn't just challenging him, they were starting to win. The cracks in the empire were forming, and for the first time in 2 decades, the future of darts belonged to someone else. All great empires eventually fall. Even the most dominant figures in sports history reach a point where challengers no longer look at them with fear, but with opportunity. The whispers started around the early 2010s. Not loud, not urgent, just murmurs in the background. Younger players were hitting higher averages. The gaps in Taylor's dominance, once microscopic, were now visible if you look closely enough. The rest of the field wasn't just playing to make up the numbers anymore. They wanted to beat him, and worse, they believed they could. Then came Michael van Gerwen, not just a young talent, a phenomenon. The first player since Taylor himself who seemed genetically engineered to play perfect darts. He wasn't intimidated, he wasn't in awe, and he sure as hell wasn't there to just make up the numbers. By 2014, the shift was undeniable. Van Gerwen had taken Taylor's crown, becoming the new world #1. This wasn't just another great player on a hot streak. This was a changing of the guard, and yet Taylor wasn't ready to step aside. His decline wasn't some dramatic freefall, it was a slow, stubborn resistance. He still won titles, still made deep runs, still turned up at the biggest events like the seasoned gunslinger refusing to be run out of town. But the dominance, the fear factor, that was gone. By 2018, the end was official. Taylor's last dance at the PDC World Championship was fittingly grand. One final run to the final, one last reminder of who he was, what he built. But the fairy tale ending wasn't in the script. Instead, it was Rob Cross, a complete unknown at the start of the year, who delivered the knockout punch, a player who had never even competed at the World Championship before. The symbolism was too obvious to ignore. The next generation had fully arrived. Taylor walked away after that match. No dramatic speeches, no tearful farewell. Just a quiet exit from the stage he had once ruled with an iron fist. And yet, his presence still looms over the sport. Every dart player today, whether they admit it or not, plays in his shadow. Because here's the thing about legacies, they don't fade just because someone else steps up. And when you win 16 world titles, break every meaningful record in the book, and redefine what greatness looks like, you don't just disappear. So yes, Taylor believes Luke Littler could surpass his record, but belief is one thing, reality is another. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that some records are only broken when the sport itself changes forever. The recently turned adult has time on his side, talent beyond his years, and a fearlessness that few players have ever shown. But time and talent aren't enough. Because Taylor didn't just set records, he built an empire. And to break his record, someone wouldn't just have to be great, they'd have to be Taylor level inevitable. They'd have to crush generations of players the way he did, and that's the part people forget. So what do you think? Will Taylor's record stand forever, or are we witnessing the rise of someone who can actually surpass the power? Let us know in the comments. There was a moment, an exact point in time, when everyone realized Michael van Gerwen wasn't just another great player. He was something different, something terrifying.
I don't know how he does it. He is phenomenal. I say he's the best. He is some player. You know, the stamina that he has is phenomenal. And
Michael wants to win all and everything. You know, you could see this is going to be a fantastic dart player. His form is phenomenal. Even when I practice with him every single week, sometimes he hits a 180 with his own dart. He says, "Ray, give me your darts." And it happens a couple of times. When he straight on, he hit my 3 darts in the treble 20 as well, so 6 darts in the treble 20. I don't know how he does it.
I mean, everybody knows what Michael's like, you know what I mean? It's like a boxing match. You've got to get on top of Michael. Trust me, you know, in my interview, there's only one way to play Michael, is go out there and beat him. Because as soon as he sniffs one little thing, you know, if you hit a 60, he goes 180. If it hit 95, he goes 170. That's how Michael is.
It wasn't when he won his first major. It wasn't even when he dethroned Phil Taylor in the Premier League final. No, the moment came in the 2013 World Championship semi-final. James Wade had just been on the receiving end of something incomprehensible. Van Gerwen had rattled off 17 perfect darts in a row, a millimeter away from back-to-back 9 darters. Wade, an elite player himself, stood there like a man watching a magician pull reality apart at the seams. The crowd had barely finished gasping from the first before they were on their feet again for the second. And then, double 12 missed, but it didn't matter. Because by then, Wade knew. Everyone knew. The Van Gerwen era had begun. At his peak, Michael Van Gerwen wasn't competing against opponents, he was competing against history. He wasn't just winning, he was rewriting what was possible. The numbers were absurd. 7 straight years as world number 1, over 150 professional titles, 3 world championships, and perhaps the most terrifying stat of them all, his 2016 season where he won every single major PDC event except the World Championship. Let's put that into perspective. Phil Taylor's reign was built on consistency across 2 decades, but even in his best years, he never swept an entire season like Van Gerwen did in 2016. That wasn't dominance, it was total control. And then there were the averages. Every darts player lives and dies by their 3-dart average, a number that separates the great from the good. A 100 average is elite, a 110 average almost unheard of, and yet in the 223.4 average, 123 on live television against actual world-class opposition. That's not just great, that's breaking the game itself. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. The real measure of Van Gerwen's greatness was how opponents reacted to him. There was a look players would get, a mix of frustration and helplessness, the sigh after yet another 180, the forced smile after watching Van Gerwen obliterate a finish that should have been impossible. It wasn't just that he won, it was that, for a period, he made every other pro look like an amateur. Michael Van Gerwen's dominance didn't happen by accident. It wasn't the result of luck, or a single hot streak, or some moment of divine inspiration. It was built, meticulously, relentlessly, over years of frustration, failure, and hard lessons learned. Because for all the chaos he would later unleash on a dartboard, Van Gerwen's early career was anything but smooth. He exploded onto the scene in his teenage years, a raw, ferocious talent from the Netherlands who seemed destined to take over the sport. He was throwing 9-darters on television at 17, dismantling seasoned pros and playing with a swagger that suggested he already knew how this story was supposed to end. The hype was real, and for a brief moment, so was the fear. But darts has a way of humbling even the most talented players. By the time he made the jump to the PDC, Van Gerwen's invincibility had cracked. The raw ability was still there, but the results weren't. For years, he struggled to convert promise into wins. He'd flash brilliance in moments, a ridiculous checkout here, an insane burst of scoring there, but he couldn't sustain it. He was getting beaten, a lot. And when you're supposed to be the next big thing, losing doesn't just hurt. It lingers, it makes people talk, it makes them doubt. And in professional darts, doubt is lethal. For a while, it looked like Van Gerwen might end up as just another what-if story. Another young talent who never quite figured it out. But the thing about Van Gerwen, the thing that separates him from all the other players who flamed out before they ever got going, is that he hated losing. More than that, he hated the idea that he wasn't living up to what he was supposed to be. So he did what every great player eventually does. He adapted. The reckless aggression, still there, but now controlled. The scoring bursts, still devastating, but now consistent. The firepower, somehow even more terrifying. By 2012, everything clicked. The wins started coming. The 9-darters weren't just party tricks anymore, they were tactical weapons. He wasn't just beating top players, he was taking them apart. And in 2013, he finally beat Taylor in the Premier League final, in a match that felt less like a title fight and more like a hostile takeover. The floodgates were open.
Treble 17 and gets it. That's unbelievable, Wayne. That is unbelievable. That's exactly what he needed. Now, treble 19 for the bullseye. What an amazing finish! What an amazing finish! To an amazing game! And Van Gerwen is the Macaulay Premier League champion.
Michael Van Gerwen celebrates his victory with the crowd. And Phil Taylor, sporting in defeat, claps his hands and says, "You're good, kid. Well done."
Van Gerwen didn't take over darts because he was the most talented. He took over because for years, he got knocked down, got back up, and kept sharpening the blade. By the time he reached his peak, he wasn't just good, he was a monster. And for the next 5 years, the darts world belonged to him. For 5 years, Michael van Gerwen wasn't just the best darts player in the world, he was a statistical anomaly, a force of nature disguised as a man in a neon green shirt. Opponents didn't just lose to him, they got left behind. The moment they started thinking they might be in the game, he would shift gears, launching a flurry of 180s and clinical checkouts that turned their optimism into existential dread. It was like playing a slot machine that only paid out for one person. And the most terrifying part? He made it look easy. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, no wasted movement. When Van Gerwen was locked in, the process was brutally simple. Walk up, fire missiles, turn around before the last dart even hits the board. The rhythm was hypnotic, the consistency unfair, as a public execution. You think you've got him, you're in front, then he just goes 140, 180, some stupid outshot, and it's over. For 5 years, Michael van Gerwen operated at a level that barely seemed real. He made his competition irrelevant, but as every great champion learns, dominance is a temporary condition. No one stays on top forever, and eventually, the machine slowed down. For 7 years, Michael van Gerwen stood at the top of the darts world, undisputed, untouchable, and unstoppable. But even the most dominant players find themselves at the mercy of time, and cracks had started to appear. It wasn't that he had fallen off a cliff, he was still reaching finals like the PDC final versus Littler, still winning major titles, but he wasn't inevitable anymore. Darts is a game of margins, and when you operate at the highest level, those margins are razor thin. For years, Van Gerwen had lived in a space where those margins simply didn't exist. He was so much better than everyone else that close games weren't even a factor, but slowly the field caught up. Gerwen Price, Peter Wright, Michael Smith. Players who once walked onto the stage knowing they needed a miracle were now stepping up, expecting to win, and that changes everything. The 2020 World Championship was the first real sign that the tides had shifted. Van Gerwen still made it to the final, still played at a high level, but he lost. And not to Phil Taylor or another aging legend, but to Peter Wright, one of the new generation, a player who once looked second tier compared to Van Gerwen's peak. That was the moment it became clear that this wasn't just a bad tournament or a short dip in form. The machine wasn't running as smoothly as it used to. By 2021, the numbers confirmed what the eyes had already seen. After 2,559 days, 7 straight years, Michael van Gerwen was no longer the world number one. For the first time in nearly a decade, Van Gerwen had opponents who weren't afraid of him anymore. That changes the margins, that changes everything. He still wins, he still competes, but the days of absolute certainty, the days when a Van Gerwen final felt like a formality, are gone. And so the question remains, was Michael van Gerwen's peak greater than Phil Taylor's, or was it simply a different kind of dominance? The debate over Michael van Gerwen versus Phil Taylor isn't as simple as counting trophies or tallying world titles. That's what makes it interesting. If dominance were purely a numbers game, Taylor wins by default. But sport is never that straightforward. It's about context, impact, how a player wins, and what they do to the competition around them. Taylor ruled darts for 2 decades, reshaping the sport in his image. He was a methodical, disciplined tyrant of the oche, grinding down opponents with unshakable precision. He didn't just beat them, he conditioned them to expect defeat. That's a different kind of power, one that accumulates over time and stretches across generations. Van Gerwen, he didn't have time for slow suffocation. His game was an explosion, a high-velocity attack that shattered players before they even understood what had happened. He wasn't designed for 20 years of sustained rule. He was built for lightning strike devastation. At his best, he played a level of darts that even Taylor never touched. That's not an opinion, it's in the numbers. The highest televised average ever recorded, Van Gerwen. The only player to make a 110 average seam routine, Van Gerwen. The most dominant single year in the sport's history, Van Gerwen, 2016. But then, there's the other side of the argument. Taylor didn't just peak, he sustained. He held on to his throne for an absurd length of time, outlasting entire generations of challengers. Van Gerwen had 5 years at the summit, Taylor had 20. That's not just longevity, it's a monopoly on greatness. And then there's the mental side. Players crumbled against both of them, but in different ways. Taylor's game was psychological erosion, the slow crushing realization that no matter how well you played, it wouldn't be enough. Van Gerwen, he took hope away much faster. He hit 180, 180, 140 checkout, and suddenly a match that felt competitive was over before the scoreboard had caught up. So who was better? It depends on what you value more. If you're looking at pure, raw peak ability, there's an argument that Van Gerwen was the most dominant force darts has ever seen. But if you're talking about the greatest player, the one who defined the game and held it in a vice grip for decades, then it's still Taylor. The real question isn't whether Van Gerwen was as good as Taylor, it's whether anyone will ever dominate like Taylor again. Did you know that without Eric Bristow, darts history might have looked completely different? No Phil Taylor, no modern PDC dominance, no global rise of the sport. Bristow wasn't just the best of his era, he was the blueprint. He played the game with swagger. In an era where darts was more about personality than precision, Bristow had both. And when he was at his peak, he wasn't just winning, he was shaping the future of the game. So today, we're diving back into the golden years to find out just how good prime Eric Bristow really was. Let's get into it. Eric Bristow didn't just win, he suffocated the competition. Before a single dart was thrown, he had already occupied space in his opponent's mind, setting up camp with that knowing smirk and an air of inevitability. His confidence wasn't just unshakable, it was infectious. If you weren't careful, you'd start believing in it yourself. He moved at his own rhythm, deliberate yet unbothered, as if the match was a formality, but winning was just one part of it. Once you see the way he toyed with some of the biggest names in the sport, you'll understand why no lead was ever safe against him. The slight pause before he stepped up, the way he leaned in like he was letting the dartboard in on a private joke. Every movement was designed to remind you that this was his game, and when the time came to close, he wasn't just accurate, he was ruthless. Doubles didn't stand a chance. He had the kind of composure that made other players nervous in the quiet moments. The way he'd watch, arms crossed as you lined up a crucial shot. No words needed, just that unbearable silence stretching longer than it should. If you missed, you weren't getting another chance. Where others faltered, Bristow fed off pressure. It sharpened him. He played like he was daring you to find a flaw in his game, fully aware you wouldn't. For nearly a decade, he didn't just dominate darts, he owned it. Winning a world title is tough. Winning 2, that puts you among the all-time greats. But winning 5 when darts was still carving out its identity as a professional sport, that was unheard of. And yet, by the time Eric Bristow was done, that's exactly what he had. 5 world championships, each one solidifying his status as the sport's first true superstar. His trophy cabinet was obscene. World Masters titles, countless major wins, victories in every format imaginable. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. Bristow controlled eras. He wasn't a player who had a few great seasons. He defined the 1980s. There were years where the conversation wasn't who would win, but whether anyone could even challenge him. Take his dominance on the biggest stage. The 1984 final against Dave Whitcomb, a 4-set sweep that felt more like a coronation than a contest. The 1986 final against Bob Anderson, another masterclass. When Bristow was locked in, there was nothing to be done.
This man has nerves of steel, looking at double top for the title.
Even in the rare moments he lost, it felt like a temporary glitch rather than a turning point. He wasn't the type to fade away. He regrouped, came back stronger, and reminded everyone that his throne wasn't up for grabs just yet. By the time the decade was over, Bristow was a multiple-time world champion and the absolute gold standard. Every player that came after him had to measure themselves against his shadow, and for most of them, that shadow was just too big to escape. His gamesmanship was legendary. Against Jockey Wilson, he'd linger behind him, forcing Wilson to take an extra step forward before throwing. Against John Lowe, he'd deliberately slow the pace, dragging out the tension just enough to break the rhythm. Sometimes he'd just stare, not aggressively, not confrontationally, just enough to make you wonder what he was thinking. And in darts, once you start thinking, you're already losing. But the real trick, he made you doubt yourself. You'd second guess your doubles, overcompensate on your trebles, and before you knew it, you were watching him clean up the match. Now here's the twist. Bristow knew how to break everyone else, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. Because when the collapse finally came, it wasn't another player who took him down. It was something far worse. His own body. In the late 1980s, Bristow developed a condition that, for a dart player, was nothing short of catastrophic: dartitis. A sudden involuntary loss of control over throwing mechanics. One day, the fluid, precise motion he had repeated thousands of times without thought became a battle against his own hand. A simple release turned into hesitation, his wrist locking up mid-throw like a faulty mechanism. At first, people didn't know what to make of it. Here was Bristow, a man who had dominated the sport for a decade, suddenly pausing before releases, adjusting his stance, visibly thinking about his throw, something he never did before. Opponents who once feared him started sensing weakness. The same players who had spent years being dismantled by his confidence now watched as doubt crept into his game. For the first time, Eric Bristow looked human. It didn't happen overnight, but the decline was undeniable. He was still good, very good, but no longer untouchable. And in darts, where precision is everything, even the smallest hesitation can be the difference between dominance and mediocrity.
The game you love doing, all of a sudden you can't do anymore, and then you're thinking, well, I might not be able to do exhibitions here. So all of a sudden, what do I do at the age of 30, whatever? Become a postman?
By the early 1990s, a new generation was rising. Phil Taylor, Bristow's own protege, was beginning to assert himself. Taylor didn't just play like the future, he played like a man who had spent years studying under a master and was now surpassing him. Bristow fought. He tried different grips, different rhythms, anything to overcome the dartitis, and on sheer determination alone, he still managed to stay competitive. But the aura, the untouchable presence, that was fading. The psychological edge he had over his rivals had flipped. Now he was the one being studied, he was the one opponents felt they could beat. The moment that symbolized the shift came in 1990, when Bristow faced Taylor in the BDO World Championship final. The ultimate full-circle moment. Taylor, the man Bristow had mentored and funded, was now the one standing across from him, ready to take his place at the top. And the match wasn't even close. Taylor destroyed him 6-1, and in that moment, it was clear. The Bristow era was officially over. He had built a dynasty, he had dominated a decade, but darts had moved forward, and for the first time in his career, Eric Bristow was chasing, not leading. Most players, when their prime is over, fade into the background. Their names become statistics, their records eventually surpassed. But Eric Bristow wasn't just another champion, he was the foundation. Even after his decline, his influence never left the game. You could see it in the players who came after him, the way they carried themselves, the confidence they projected. Bristow set the standard for how to win. The swagger, the mind games, the ironclad belief that the match was over before it even began. That wasn't just his strategy, it became the template for future greats. And nowhere was his influence stronger than in Phil Taylor. Bristow built Taylor. He saw raw talent, backed it with his own money, and turned a factory worker from Stoke into the most dominant player the sport had ever seen. When Taylor dethroned Bristow in 1990, it was the end of one era and the start of a new one. Without Bristow, there's no Phil Taylor, and without Taylor, darts as we know it today doesn't exist. But Bristow's impact was cultural. Before him, darts was a pub game, played by blue-collar guys for small purses. By the time he was done, it was a televised spectacle with real money, real stakes, and a real future. He made people care. His brashness, his presence, the way he carried himself, it turned darts into entertainment. He was the first real star of the sport, and even in retirement, his personality never dulled. Whether it was commentary, media work, or just stirring the pot at tournaments, Bristow remained a towering figure. He didn't do humble, he didn't do quiet, and that's exactly why people still talked about him. So, how good was prime Eric Bristow? The titles, the dominance, the aura, it all speaks for itself. But the real answer is simpler. Darts wouldn't be what it is today without him. Because as legendary as Bristow was, his biggest impact wasn't just his own success, it was what came next. For nearly a decade, there was only one man who could genuinely shake Phil Taylor's confidence. One player who on his day was unstoppable. Raymond van Barneveld wasn't just a great darts player, he was a movement. Before him, darts was just another British pub sport. After him, it was primetime TV in the Netherlands with sold-out arenas and millions watching at home. And the way he played? Effortless power, silky smooth throwing, and an unmatched presence at the oche. But here's the crazy part. If just a few key moments had gone differently, Barney might have been even greater than he already was. Raymond van Barneveld wasn't just a 5-time world champion, he was the first player to truly challenge Phil Taylor's reign. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't overwhelmed, and in 2007, he did something that few thought was possible. He beat prime Taylor on the biggest stage in one of the greatest matches of all time.
Tops he wants.
And he gets it! Barneveld is the champion of the world!
He goes Eric Bristow's 5-title record! What a player!
What a player! there! What a comeback! What a match!
But Barney's story isn't just about winning titles, it's about revolutionizing an entire sport. He turned the Netherlands into a darts powerhouse, built a fan base unlike anything the game had seen, and inspired a new generation of players who still carry his influence today. So today, we're going deep into his prime, his dominance, his greatest battles, and why he could go toe-to-toe with Taylor when almost nobody else could. But before we get into all that, we need to start with the moment that changed everything. The match that made Raymond van Barneveld a household name. Raymond van Barneveld was just another unknown player grinding his way through the ranks. He wasn't a teenage prodigy. He wasn't someone people expected to change the sport. In fact, by the time he started making a name for himself, he was already in his late 20s, an age when most future greats had already won something big. But when Barney arrived, he did it in style. His breakthrough moment came in the 1995 BDO World Championship, where he made an unexpected run to the final. Nobody saw it coming. He wasn't a top seed, he wasn't the favourite, and yet, there he was, on the biggest stage of his life, facing darts legend Richie Burnett for the world title. It was supposed to be a coronation for Burnett. Instead, Barney gave him a war. The Dutchman forced the match all the way to a deciding set, pushing Burnett to the absolute limit before finally falling short. And while he lost that day, something had changed. People had noticed him. 3 years later, Barney was back. This time, he wasn't leaving empty-handed. In 1998, he faced Burnett again, but this time, there was no heartbreak. Barney controlled the final, closed out the match, and lifted his first World Championship trophy, the first for any Dutch player in history. And with that win, everything changed.
Double 8, 2 darts 4, does he need them? Can he do it in one for the title? It's there! It's there! Look at him, Ray Barneveld! He's crying! Ray Barneveld!
In the Netherlands, darts exploded. The sport went from being a niche hobby to a national obsession. Television ratings skyrocketed. Dutch fans started filling up arenas, and it was all because of one man, Raymond van Barneveld. But while he was dominating the BDO, something was brewing in the PDC. The level of competition was rising, the prize money was getting bigger, and Phil Taylor was untouchable. And soon, Barney would have to make a choice. Stay in the comfort of his kingdom, or step into the lion's den and take on the greatest of all time. Raymond made it look effortless. His throw was one of the smoothest the game had ever seen. No jerky movements, no unnecessary adjustments, just a fluid, controlled release that sent darts gliding into the treble 20 like they belonged there. When Barney was in rhythm, it felt like he could stand at the oche all day and never miss. But what made him truly special wasn't just his mechanics, it was the way he handled moments. Some players thrive in early rounds, racking up easy wins before crumbling under the pressure of a final. Not Barney. When the stakes were at their highest, he played his best darts. That's why he won 5 world titles across 2 different organizations, 4 in the BDO, and then his legendary PDC world title in 2007. And it wasn't just the titles, the stats back it up. One of the highest TV averages ever recorded at his peak, a 9-dart finish on the biggest stage, major tournament wins across 3 decades. Barney wasn't a flash-in-the-pan champion, he had longevity. But as good as Barney was, there was always one man standing in his way, and when they finally clashed, it gave us one of the greatest matches in darts history. For over a decade, Phil Taylor was untouchable. The gap between him and everyone else wasn't just wide, it was a canyon. World-class players would step up, play the best darts of their lives, and still get steamrolled. But then came Raymond van Barneveld. Barney wasn't intimidated, he wasn't overwhelmed. And unlike most of Taylor's opponents, he didn't step onto the stage hoping to win. He stepped up expecting to. The moment that defined their rivalry came in the 2007 PDC World Championship final, a match so intense that even Taylor admitted later that he felt genuine pressure. Taylor came in as the favourite, as always. He had already won 13 world titles, and most expected him to make it 14. Barney, meanwhile, was still adjusting to life in the PDC after making the jump from the BDO just a year prior. But from the start, it was clear, this wasn't going to be another Taylor masterclass. The match was a dogfight. The 2 traded sets, both averaging over 100, hitting massive finishes and refusing to back down. The tension in the arena was unreal. And then, after nearly 2 hours of elite level darts, it all came down to a sudden death leg. one leg to decide the World Championship. Barney won the ball, threw first, and produced one of the most clutch legs of his life. He outlasted Taylor. He outplayed Taylor. And when that final dart hit double 20, he beat Taylor. The streak was broken. The greatest player of all time had been taken down at his peak. For the first time in years, Taylor looked beatable. And Barney, he had just cemented himself as one of the greatest players to ever step up. But while Barney had the talent to go toe-to-toe with Taylor, there was something holding him back. Something that stopped him from taking over completely. Because while Taylor had an ironclad mentality, Barney had doubts. And those doubts would cost him more than just a few matches. They'd cost him a shot at being the undisputed best player in the world. Van Barneveld had the talent, he had the throw, but what he didn't have? The unshakable mentality that kept Taylor at the top for 2 decades. And that's what held him back. Barney was a confidence player. When he felt good, he was unstoppable. But when things started to go wrong, those small cracks in his mindset turned into huge gaps. And once those doubts crept in, his game suffered. You could see it in his body language. Unlike Taylor, who stared straight ahead like a machine, Barney wore every emotion on his face. When he was struggling, you knew it. He'd shake his head after a bad dart. He'd sigh, slump his shoulders, mutter to himself. And his opponents, they fed off that. And that inconsistency showed up in his results. One week, he'd take down a world-class field and look like the best player on the planet. The next, he'd crash out early, barely resembling the same guy. That's what made him so frustrating to watch. You knew he had the ability to dominate, but unlike Taylor, who maintained his level year after year, Barney's form came and went like the wind. By the early 2010s, a new wave of players, Michael van Gerwen, Gary Anderson, Adrian Lewis, was rising. And while Barney still had moments of brilliance, they were moments, not eras. Then came the retirement roller coaster. Barney retired, then unretired, then retired again, then made a comeback. It was a pattern. Every time he walked away, it felt like he wasn't really done. And every time he returned, it felt like he was chasing something that had already slipped away.
Of course. I know I retired because I wasn't myself anymore. The last years in my career were bad, private problems, and I said I'm going to give up because I'm a nightmare for everyone around me. And then a couple of months later, COVID, Corona was there. I couldn't do any exhibitions, and I was divorcing and all. And I'm thinking, yeah, what to do next? I was bored.
But here's the thing: despite all the struggles, despite the inconsistency, Barney's legacy was already set in stone. Because no matter how many times he doubted himself, the impact he had on darts could never be erased. And that's what we're about to get into next. For all the ups and downs, all the moments of brilliance and the frustrating collapses, Raymond van Barneveld left behind something no slump or early exit could erase, a legacy that changed darts forever. Before Barney, the Netherlands could take or leave darts. It was a country where the sport barely registered. But after his breakthrough, it became a national obsession. They travelled to the UK in massive numbers, turning every major tournament into a sea of orange. And today, that legacy lives on through the players he inspired. Michael van Gerwen, one of the most dominant players of the modern era, grew up watching Barney. In interviews, he's admitted that without Barney, he wouldn't have picked up a dart. And he's not alone. Every top Dutch player that followed, Danny Noppert, Dirk, Jeffrey de Zwaan, all point back to Barney as the reason they started. But his impact wasn't just in the Netherlands. Barney brought something to darts that few players ever have: emotion. When he won, he felt it. When he lost, he felt it. He made fans care because they saw a piece of themselves in him. He wasn't a robotic, cold-blooded killer like Taylor. He was human. He doubted himself. He got frustrated. But when he found his rhythm, he produced moments of pure magic. And that's why, even though he didn't dominate like Taylor, even though he had stretches where he disappeared, he's still one of the most beloved players in darts history. Because greatness isn't just about stats, it's about impact. So, how good was prime Raymond van Barneveld? Good enough to shake Phil Taylor, good enough to change the sport, good enough to be remembered forever. And if you thought Barney's prime was crazy, wait until you see what Phil Taylor did to the sport, because that era was something else.